Entertaining enough that you don't fall to sleep after a long day. And I know you're all eager, that's why you joined my session, to know what the Rolling Stones, Frank Sinatra and the Lord of the Rings has to do with Lightning component development, right? So let's start with the Stones. Please allow to introduce myself. I'm a man of not so much wealth as Mick Jagger probably, but yeah, so my name is Christian Menzinger. I'm working for an ISV partner in Munich, Germany. And so I'm actually, the name of the company is Apero. So here you have the company information about our GitHub repo and our Twitter handle. So I'm a developer in Salesforce for 3.5 years. And probably what's not the typical is that my first touch point with Salesforce was the SOAP API, and the second was Lightning components. So I missed Visualforce, and I did a little bit of Apex afterwards, but so Lightning components was actually the first real touch point with Salesforce. And so since the late 2015, since the early beta of Lightning components, I'm working with that technology. I'm also leading with a colleague of mine the Munich developer group in Munich. So that's about me. So what you can expect, as I said, it's the last talk. Hopefully I can keep you entertained. And definitely we want to climb up the hill. So the idea is I want to share some of my all-day daily knowledge that you can get some ideas to climbing up the hill, to leveraging the Lightning Components framework to get a better work done in the future. So that's what I want to work. Fundamental thinking for awesome admins and users. But of course, I'm a coder, so code for developers, I show some code as well. Should I use a microphone? Maybe. Yeah? Okay. No worries. This one? Is this working? Yep. Is this working? Yeah, okay. That's this one. Okay, so far. So, as I said, I want to give you some practical example from a developer's life. So, you have to do a Apex call. So, how do you do this? I don't know. I Google for that. So when you go to Google and you say calling an Aura action with Lightning components, so what you want to get? You want to get a search result for the Lightning component developer documentation. So far so good. So anyone in the room has done this Google search and get up this page here. So anyone in the room has written the code for calling an Apex controller in Lightning components. Raise up your hands. Who has written this code? Okay. Who has Googled this search more than one time? So could you remember after the one time you implemented it, the second time, without Googling it again and doing this code again? So who has written it more than once? Okay, nearly the same hands, and all the others are really genius. Because when you have a look at this code here, which is the official component documentation, as I said, we can inspect this code, and the question is this productional code? So can you just copy this code, paste it to your Lightning component and deploy it to your production org? I don't think so, because when you have a look at deeper, here you have some markups, do something optionally set, you have console logs, you have an alert, so all things you probably don't want to have for production. So we had exactly the same problem, or I had exactly the same problem. And that's the example how you can leverage Lightning Components framework that helps you in the future. So what's the problem about this? As I said, most of the developers are Frank Sinatra fans because I did it my way. So when you have this template code and you have a lot of comments what you have to write by yourself for especially error handling, every developer is probably doing it differently. And if you're working as an ISV partner, so you're building a more complex project, you want to have multiple Apex calls and multiple code locations from multiple developers. So probably every developer is doing it a little bit different. So you don't have a consistent behavior. And that's actually, especially in the error handling part, this is something you don't want to have. So what about this error handling? Console log, alert, a toast message, a modal component, something different. So you have to make this consistently all over your project because you don't want to have different code locations handling the same stuff differently. So, and also I don't want to re-Google this template code and modify it again and again. So that's why we thought, okay, we can build a component which is doing exactly this stuff. Okay, let's jump into that. So the idea is one ring to rule them all. So I don't want to have that one code location which manages the code just one time. So just one guy has to implement it, one guy has to think about error handling, one guy is writing that code, and all the others just can use this code. So we need a consistent behavior. We need one code location, and I don't want to fiddle around with the same code over and over again. So as I said, that's the idea, and probably you also find some prototyping boilerplate code somewhere in your organization. And so you could take this idea, building a Lightning component to reduce this code locations to only one. So when I come to that problem, so I analyzed and said, okay, I don't want to fiddle around with that code again. So, and I said it already, I want to have a consistent behavior. So what is a behavior? When you have a little bit of coding background, you're probably familiar with some object-oriented best practices and concepts. And so a behavior in object-oriented principles are actually a method. Okay, so I could start from using this template code. I have to create a helper method. So that's the idea. I just do prototyping here. I do not know the end where I come from. I just have a problem and I know, okay, a behavior is actually a method. So I could just try to get a method done which is handling all that stuff. And so what I have to think about is what is actually the changing parts of my code template you have seen before. So what are the things which has to be more flexible from time to time? So when we have a look at this, these are actually the essentials of this template code. So you will find when you make a call out to Apex class, you need the method name, obviously. You have to know the name of the method, what you're calling for. You also have to pass some parameters. Obviously, this is also something which will change from time to time. And obviously, the result, what the server is responding to you, that is also something which is not the same from every call. And when you go into that code, and you're familiar with that code template, these are exactly the code locations which you have to modify, because these are the 3 code locations which are not that flexible. Okay, so I'm focusing on the Apex function name, the calling parameters, and the return values. That's actually what I have to do. So when I use this code and I create a new helper, then I could just create a new helper method, or just a function, where I paste this code. The only difference is that I'm replacing those parts which should be flexible. Okay? So when you have a look at over here, and I can zoom a little bit, that it is better readable. It's not working in PowerPoint. It is. Okay, here we go. All right, so okay, so these are the code locations which has to be modified. Okay, so that means that I cannot hard code something like the method name in Apex, so I have to pass a parameter to that function to make it more flexible. It's just a normal function call. I pass the information in, and I'm using a variable which contains this information. And this is actually what I'm doing. So I'm pasting the code from the developer documentation into a function. I named it call Apex, well, because that's what it does. And rather than having only one parameter component, I just pass in a little bit more. In this case, I have to know the controller method, I have to know the action parameters, and I have to do something like a callback. And this is probably something which is the trickiest part on it. So what's actually a callback? So when you do an Apex call, this happens asynchronously. So that means you make the call out, but the result is not available immediately. So you have to wait. This is done by the framework automatically. You just have to add a callback. So that means it is a function which is invoked when the method is ready. And so I'm using the same concept, the demo code also using a callback. You see it already, action set callback. But the only thing what I do is, I don't want to handle my result somewhere in this call Apex method, because I want to be flexible, right? So because method A is handled different as method B, or function the caller from A and B is handled different. And so I cannot handle it in this code as a developer documentation because otherwise I can't reuse it. So it has to be more flexible. And that's the reason why I just pass something in which is just a JavaScript function, another JavaScript function, which is invoked manually by me, and I just call this method and get the response value, what I get from the server to that certain method. Okay, so it's not really different from what has been there before. I just, make it a little bit more comfortable for me. So, is this idea that I have a method, and this method, by the way, this method is defined just another helper function, which is just a normal method. I just define it, and I can invoke this method by some parameters which I define. So this method is just invoked from the other method. Is that idea okay? Because this is very important. Because this is the trickiest part. When I pass in a callback method, and I call the callback method later on, then my code is actually totally independently from some hard-coded stuff. So that's the only changes. So say again, I define a function called Apex, I paste everything from the developer documentation. The only thing I'm changing are these three parts. The controller method name is passed in, the parameters are passed in, and my callback, which I'm invoking later on, are passed in. Okay? The rest is the same as in the developer documentation. Okay, so far, what did we achieve? How can we go there? So this call Apex method can be used several times. So I can invoke the same method from different locations. So, for instance, I not only have this one example get contact list or whatever you name this. So I use get contact list call Apex, and handling it, the result is handled by get contact list success. I do have a second one, get opportunity list, and this has just a different callback function, and of course a different parameter, and of course a different method name. Okay? So, the call Apex method is just defined once, and I can use in two different Apex calls. That's actually a very good progress. The only problem is that this only works in the same helper and the same component. So as I said, when you build a product or even you have multiple Lightning components in your project, you want to have multiple Apex calls on different components. So this approach is not working. But we have done all the necessary way of thinking. We just need the right tools to leverage the framework that it is also working on other code locations. So we had done the heavy lifting we have already. So I want to use reusability. I want to reuse it over the framework. So that means I need some encapsulation functionality. And again, so the question I'm asking is, how can other components use this abstraction of an Apex service? And when you go back to OOP, because this is a long time known, paradigm, object-oriented programming is in the field since tens of years. So a class is something like extensible program code. So I can think about, okay, I have an abstraction of an Apex service and I want to use a class. So actually what I'm doing, the idea is create an abstract base class where other components can extend from. So this is very theoretical. So this is just a way of thinking I had by myself to solve this problem. So I have to need some base abstraction from this behavior that I can reuse it on other code locations. Okay? So what does this translate it to Lightning component? It's actually this. And it's not really hard lines of code. There's just a component definition, because a base class in Lightning component is a Lightning component, as everything is a Lightning component in the framework. So you have in Lightning component, you mark it as extensible. That means just that some others can grab what you have built into their own implementation. And you can use the abstract equals true keyword that marks the class as an abstract class. So that just means that you're not instantiating the class directly. So in terms of Lightning components, you won't use this v2 abstract component directly. It's just like, a template what you use in other code locations. Okay? And so by the way, all the code snippets, I have a repository, you can grab all these components. So the idea is, I do the implementation what I had before in the helper, I do it in an abstract class, so other components can use this. Alright, so the only thing I have to know is how can I invoke a method, what we had before, I just called it from the helper, but if it is an own component, I have to define this method somehow, and this is done by the aura method. So, I define exactly the same method or function, just declarative. Okay, I define an aura method, the name is call apex as before, I have a controller action invoked, as typically for the Lightning component framework. Then I have the parameter controller method action parameter success callback, exactly the same as before. The only difference is now it is a known component and I have to do it declaratively. So that whenever this method here is called, is invoked from another Lightning component, this action triggers into the controller. So it's like a event. So like when you click somewhere, you define an on-click handler and a controller action is invoked. So this is very typical in the framework. So nothing special. So the only thing is that you have to implement the controller. And now something is a little bit strange, because when I invoke a method, normally I would guess that I will have the parameters as defined directly in my controller method. But there's a difference in Lightning component, because the controller method always, and remember there was the trivia game before, there was what was one of these questions, what are the parameters of a Lightning component action invoked in the controller? And so it's always component, event, and helper. And so I have to grab the code, or I have to grab the parameters from these events actually. Also, again, this is something you only have to know once. That's prototyping code. So I grab my parameters and then I call my apex method in the helper. And so I write the helper and I just copy and paste what I had before. So this code here is exactly the same. Okay? So how can we use it now? The only thing is I have to extend whatever I have created before. And then I can just call in, somewhere in the helper, I just say component call apex. Remember before we had helper.call apex, because it was in the same helper. Now it is a method defined in the component, and I say component call apex. The rest is the same. Did you come to that step? Is that okay? So, how far do we get now? Actually, it's a generic component, because my abstract class does not have one line of hard-coded code, so it's totally reusable. So all informations are passed in to that component, and so I can reuse it even in other projects. I just have to copy and paste it. So, but I still have one problem. One does not simply extend multiple classes. Okay? So inheritance is always one-to-one. That's also principle. And so sometimes you have already used inheritance, so you have already extended another class. For instance, you're extending the SLDS because you're writing your own app and you want to leverage the Lightning design system. So you cannot extend SLDS and the base component I have created. And so we only have to think again about object-oriented principles, and there's that one saying, favor composition over inheritance. And composition is just meaning, don't think that something is like a service component. You should think that it has the ability to use a service component. And so you use as many components as you like in your development. That's how the Lightning component framework is designed for, using as many components. And so I only have minor code changes. The only thing is, I'm not extending, I'm not having an abstract class. I built an own component. So I just delete these expressions. And the only thing is I have to pass in the component reference who's using this, because I'm not extending anymore, so I need the component reference from the caller. And that's what I'm passing to my call apex, and still call apex is the same code. So this is the idea. And if you have done this, the only thing what you have to do is here, you have to use it now. You're not extending from the base class because you have no base class anymore. You're just using this component. Okay? And so how you reference a component with component find, and then you say call Apex as before. So nobody's gonna slow me down. If you have done this once, or you have to think about a certain code location in your environment and you build this kind of concept, then you can start thinking about, okay, what are my next steps? So how can I improve the service component I have created? So you could create a spinner into it. So every Apex call shows a spinner, or you can lock the GUI, or you can have a consistent error handling when you have only one code location. So you can spend some time building this service kind of component, and everyone will leverage this component, and everyone can get this implementation. And so the only thing what you don't have to forget when you build something like a reusable component, others have to use it, so they have to know how to use. Think about documentation. And to be honest, when you have a use case, it's sometimes easier copy and paste, it's sometimes faster copy and paste. When you build a reusable generic component, it takes more time, but in the end, it always pays out, especially if you have a long-term product. So what's the conclusion? Actually, build more components. Okay, you all think about use cases in your org, identify recurring tasks and code in your project. Be generic to be reusable. So remove hard-coded things, pass things in, fiddle around, do trailheads, read the fucking manual, of course, and share your problems. So, for instance, join a local developer group. So I have a resources slide where also the repository for this code location is there, and so that is the idea. I know it's a kind of a pressure about code, but when you take your time, go through the code, it's just minor changes on the one and the other side, and at the end you become a component what helps you on every Apex call in the future. And as I said, you can just go into the next step and build this component better and better and better, and you only have that one component to maintain and can reuse it all over your framework. So far, do you have any questions on that topic? You're just overwhelmed by the beauty of code, I can imagine.
Most important one should be flip back to the other slide, because you had that standing for about 1 second.
Which one? This one?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I need to take a memo.
Definitely. So look at GitHub apero-com. There you will find also the presentation and the thing. I will put the presentation online. And so that's the message. Build more components. Start now. Any other remarks on the presentation? All right, so let's go for the closing keynote and then having a beer together. Cheers.